development of a program. So it was pretty clear to us in the early summer of 2021 that there was not much movement from the city administrator. So I reached out, our commission reached out, and we asked kind of what was going on. And there didn't seem to be much research going on. And so we kind of, we suggested to the city administrator that, gee, you really need to do a lot of research. There are a lot of unarmed response programs around the country, and you should be checking them out. You should be looking at them and trying to figure out what would work best in Ann Arbor, or at least coming up with a skeleton of a framework and then taking it to the community. And the city administrator did not do that for whatever reason. And you may know that that city administrator, Tom Crawford, was later fired, not because of anything we did with us. But then we had an interim city administrator who also did not seem to be working on it. And so what happened was a group of community members came together. It's a pretty diverse group, public health workers, activists, racial justice organizers, researchers from the University of Michigan, from Eastern Michigan University, people who were impacted by policing, impacted by situations that could have been benefited by an unarmed response. And so we came together and we talked about, how we might develop a plan of our own, since it didn't seem like the city was going to do that. Then in mid-December, so the plan was due from the city in December. So Crows launched a plan in the fall, and we did a lot of outreach. And then it became clear that the city really hadn't done anything. And so the interim city administrator, John Fournier, pretty much just took the Crows plan and proposed it as the city's plan in late December. So one of the things that's really important to us as we think about a plan, and the city will develop a request for proposals in the fall to have groups apply to sort of administer an unarmed response plan now that they have allocated some ARPA funds, about $3.5 million. We think it is very important that we consider what safety really is. So when we think about, crime, a lot of people think about violent crime. If you live in Ann Arbor, you probably have the understanding that there isn't a huge amount of violent crime in Ann Arbor, but even in many, many cities, there isn't as much violent crime as we might think, particularly if you pay attention to local news. So across the country, only about 4% of communities met the definition of violent crime by the FBI. I have stats on calls for service from the Ann Arbor Police Department in 2019, 2020, and 2021. And looks like about 90% of calls to police are non-criminal calls. They are noise complaints. They are wellness checks. They are checks for, there are calls for paramedics to come out. There are some property crimes. There are some sexual assault crimes, for example. These are certainly considered violent crimes, but there are an awful lot of crimes in Ann Arbor that could be answered by someone without a gun. And so when we start to think about what calls to police really are, it's important for us to think about, kind of what police are being called for. And lots of times you'll hear conversations about unarmed response and people will say, no, people in low income communities really want the police. And what I would challenge you to do is think about the fact that we have defunded many, many, many social services. And so in many communities, police are the only resource you can call for a wide variety of things. And so people have gotten used to relying on police for things that are not necessarily criminally related. And so it is true that people rely on the police, but they're relying on them for things other than criminal calls. And so I think it's very important for us to really sort of dive into what people are calling the police for in our community and across Washtenaw County, and to a greater extent, the state of Michigan. So one of the biggest jobs we have is getting people to sort of reimagine what public safety could look like, what safety really is. And to think of an unarmed response plan is not just substitute people with no police, as much as it is people providing compassionate, caring support to communities in ways that communities can use it. And so we have found that these slides created by Luna Hewson really help people think about what public safety could be, right? And so when we think about it, we think about utilizing community members. We think about people who have lived experiences responding to calls, such as if somebody is sleeping in a public space, checking to see whether they need resources and helping direct them to resources if they would like them. In many cases, there are calls for service for people sleeping in public spaces, not because those people are impeding traffic or impeding businesses or doing anything other than sort of looking unsightly. And so assisting people who may need assistance certainly should be a part of public safety, but we need to think about sort of why we are responding to the kinds of calls we're responding to. If there's gun violence in a neighborhood, could we have what's often referred to as a violence interrupter, a person who has had lived experience in that way, addressing the conflict in a community. In some cases, this is beginning to happen in Washtenaw County as a preventative measure. Lots of gun violence happens between people who know each other. The vast majority of that does. And so lots of it could be prevented when communities have conflict solving strategies and are motivated to employ them. If you think about, Ashley, you should take this last one because this is your alley. Are you unmuted?
Now I am.
Okay.
So it's something, really to dream about as someone selling drugs to youth, right? And they're overdosing on this. This happens all the time throughout the community and it's increasing. But what if we were really connected to harm reduction organizations that intervened in those harmful drug interactions and those transactions, but then we were also supporting our youth in those healthy outcomes, and the seller was taking accountability for the harm. Maybe they didn't know what they were selling and they were just trying to survive. Maybe they didn't know how young that individual really was because we were all young and we lied about our age, right? And so thinking about what is public safety in terms of harms onto others, but also harms onto those trying to survive.
And Ashley has a wealth of experience in this area, and so I know she's going to dive into this more deeply, but she is one of those people whom people trust and whom people call when they are in these situations. And so she has a wealth of experience in these very situations and in trying to intervene and provide care to people in these situations. So one of the things our group did was we did a couple of visioning sessions and we thought about what compassionate care might look like, what public safety could feel like. And so we just did, a bunch of brainstorming to kind of think about this. And so it might look kind of warm and fuzzy, but actually we are trying to operationalize some of these things. And so public safety, we've asked community members as well. And so some of those reflections are included here. But being fully seen and heard and holding space for other people is a pretty important concept when you think about public safety. Are we able to see people for who they are and not whom we assume them to be and not whom they might present through a stereotype lens, for example? We have to be very creative in terms of thinking about what public safety could look like. And so a lot of times when you ask people what they want, people are very clear about what they don't want. We don't want police doing this. We don't want people doing that. We don't want forced hospitalizations, for example, but what could you want? And so we've been very fortunate to talk with organizations across the country about what they do and how they handle things differently. And lots of the things that they're doing on the ground actually look like some of this. So we started thinking about, well, when we do this, what happens? When you can go visit loved ones without being afraid of being locked up on your way back home to or from them. This was actually a pretty realistic experience. People talked about there were certain areas where they had some trepidation about driving for fear of being stopped and profiled and stopped. And that seemed to happen to them or their family members with some regularity. People talked about celebrations that had sort of been criminalized by other people. We think about communities where artificial borders and cages separate families. Obviously, that's very salient in the United States, but if you check out a book called Separated by Bill Lopez, who's a professor in public health at Michigan. He did a deep dive, a wonderful book on immigration rates in Washtenaw County and the impact of them and what those really look like and how those really impact families. And so this is something that's going on in our community today, despite our agreement to not cooperate with ICE. We have ICE and immigration and those kinds of things in our community, and people live with and more importantly, people live with the fear of that every single day. And so, we started to think about these kinds of things. One of those seems sort of, fuzzy, but actually is really useful, which is when we hurt each other, we think we are held in a process that heals both of us and all of us at the same time. And we see that the Dispute Resolution Center is beginning to get into this. We see some oversight agencies across the country being able to get into this, some types of mediation, and we haven't been able to achieve this in Ann Arbor, but we have seen in places like New Orleans, for example, there are instances where you can have police and citizens come together after a complaint and without any impunity sort of sit down and have conversations about what happened. And people who have lodged complaints about the police talk about how healing it has been for them to hear the police officer talk about what they were doing, and in many cases apologize for the harm that they've caused because the police thought they were doing one thing and ended up doing a different thing, or the impact of their behaviors were far reaching. And then as a byproduct, this certainly was not the intent of the oversight agency, but you see police behavior changing. And so while we could argue the relevance or importance of police, I think as long as we have to have them, as long as we do have them, maybe we don't have to have them, but as long as we do have them, it's important for us to think about how they are behaving in our communities as well. So that's, sort of, that's important to us as well. All right, so we want to talk about some of the values of our group, and this is sort of leading to where we're going and what we're attempting to do in Ann Arbor and across Washtenaw County. And so what we have found is that many ways in which organizations and the processes of those organizations are set up are certainly based on some white supremacist values. We think it is important to value interconnectedness, interdependence, the wisdom of people who have been doing this for a long time, and we can talk about some real world examples of how people use ancestral knowledge. We value being accountable to everyone, and that it's most important for the people who are most impacted to be centered in this work. And that means, for example, that when the city is doing outreach on what an unarmed response program should look like, it should not necessarily just hold Zoom meetings with people who are able to afford to take the time to participate in city processes, but they need to hit the streets and interview people who are most impacted by an unarmed response program. And that could mean churches who provide warming centers, but it could also mean people on the streets. And that's not typically how outreach is done. Outreach is often conducted at the convenience of the people doing outreach, not based on the needs of the people who will be served by the programs. And so that's super, super important. And so we want to think about sort of creating the future that we want to see, and that does require some imagination, as I talked about before. We believe in radical consent, and that means that people should be able to consent to what is happening to them. And there's a huge debate over, for example, involuntary psychiatric commitments, and that is not something that we believe is appropriate. The research bears out that that is not useful and often causes more harm than good. You probably know in the state of Michigan, the holds that people have are often 24, 48, at most 72 hours. And we believe that people should have the ability to determine what's going to happen to them. So we have created a research and platform. I'm happy to share these links in the chat once I can get out of this mode. And we have been endorsed by over 50 local organizations. We had a petition that garnered over 800 individual signatures, and the platform was developed in concert with researchers in the field, with other organizations across the country, and with people who had been through these experiences. I want to point out that the goal in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County is not to reinvent the wheel. The CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon has been in operation since 1989. We have been able to talk directly with their executive director, their director, their workers, one-on-one in many contexts. We've been able to talk about the pros and cons of what they do, things that they wish they could do differently, the ways in which they are embedded with the government, et cetera, the way they get funded, et cetera. And there are pilot programs, at least 13 pilot programs in other cities. There are a couple missing actually, and proposed programs across the country as well. And so these are programs that you could check out, and each of them is sort of tailored to the community in which they sit. And so this time, what we are proposing is that we be funded by city government. So CROWS would like to develop a plan that takes advantage of the funding that Ann Arbor has committed to unarmed response. However, if the request for proposals has tenets in it, such as monitoring and surveillance that do not align with CROWS values, it is not something that CROWS will apply for. And Ashley can talk a lot about why that kind of surveillance and monitoring, though necessary to document funding and expenditures, can also turn out to be very, very harmful for people. And so CROWS is proposing a completely separate entity. That is not to say that 911 dispatch, which is operated by Washtenaw County, could not refer people to the unarmed response plan. That is absolutely fine. We have talked to police officers who feel like that is something that they are eager to do, to pass off calls that they don't feel qualified for and calls that they don't feel like are in the police purview. They have identified many kinds of calls that they felt like someone else would have been better qualified to respond to, for example. And so we would like to be separate from law enforcement and operate independently, but that is not to say that there could not be cooperation with law enforcement. And I think that's commonly misunderstood. A separate phone number is very, very important. And a separate dispatch system is very important to avoid some of the challenges of surveillance. GIS location, storing people's addresses, et cetera, and doing subsequent kind of law enforcement or surveillance activity around people who call in for help. A 2-year pilot is necessary to get a program up and running and to collect data to show its effectiveness. And so we're expecting that the city will put out a request for proposals coming up, and CROWS would apply for that if it turns out to be aligned with its values. We have been funded by the United Way and others to go out and do outreach in the community as well, do focus groups with people directly impacted by who could use an unarmed response program. And that includes students at the university, includes people who are unhoused, people who are using drugs, people who have accessed emergency services. And we are dedicated to making sure that those people's voices are heard and that their perspectives are included in the development of a program. So it's not so much to take in their information and hear what they're saying, but that to develop a program around that feedback. And so this is just sort of a rough flow chart of what a dispatch might look like. And you can see that calls certainly could be routed to an independent dispatch from 911. People could call it directly, et cetera. One of the things that's important is that we see crisis responders all around the country who have lived experiences. It is certainly necessary for some personnel to have some licensing by the state, but other people might, but a system like this would be well served by people who do not necessarily have those licensures, but have those lived experiences. And there's a huge amount of data on violence interrupters. And that is not something for which you could get licensed, but it is something for which you have lived experience. And those people behave differently in violent situations and are expert at dealing with them and are far more equipped than people who get, state licensure for other kinds of things. These are some of the endorsements that we have received in Ann Arbor and across the state of Michigan, and a couple of national groups as well. This is just a timeline for sort of how things have progressed in terms of getting input from other organizations and experts in the field. And then within CROWS, there is a care-based safety team that is actually working to design a program now, consulting with experts like Ashley, consulting with community members. And so we were fortunate to get a couple of grants to do that and are currently working on developing a program as we get feedback from the community. Ashley, take that away.
Thank you. So I want to talk about really the safety of an unarmed response that's really not connected to any carceral systems for people who are using criminalized substances. And I say that because we're all drug users. My coffee, nicotine, whatever it is. And so I don't want to put a this or that to individuals. You can go to the next slide. So when I looked at CROWS values, a lot of them relate to harm reduction. And you'll see I wrote capital H, capital R for harm reduction. And this is more of the societal structures and focusing on shifting power and resources to people most vulnerable to structural violence, including people who engage in sex work and people who use drugs. Next slide. You can click the next slide. Oh, okay. And so another big piece of this is looking at those harm reduction set of philosophy and set of practical empowerment-based strategies designed to reduce from the risk associated with drug use, sex trade, self-injury, eating disorder, violence, policing. It's about centering that individual and collective models of care so that we do have a larger safety, right, in our communities and within the context that we're living in. And I think when we talk about unarmed response, we really got to think about what happens when police are called, especially as the war on people who use drugs is just kind of shifting. You know, we've failed for 50 years, but we've had now tremendous impacts for people who use that create barriers and health inequities, such as housing, right? You can't get housing, employment, education, family regulation, so CPS, right? You get one call, CPS is knocking on your door, public benefits, and also immigration. So things that really could help somebody in their journey to recovery, to healing, all these things that could set up people that could improve their quality of life. Next slide. And so when we think about the unarmed response, you can go to the next slide.
Oh, hang on one sec. I'm slower than you. All right, there we go. Is that better?
Yeah, my computer was freezing all day. So, but also like when we criminalize substance use, right? And so when people are calling 911 for an overdose, this impacts individuals, but also the community. So people aren't calling for overdose reversals. They're scared. Whatever their situation is, it could be teenagers scared to call the police, right? And those seconds count into getting someone the medical attention they need. HIV, hepatitis C is rampant because people are forced to hide their use and share syringes and other works. And then also those quality of life things of if they wanted to go to a treatment, can they get into a treatment? Do they have a record? Are they allowed in, you know, or are they forced to go to jail? You can go to the next slide. So when I talk about this, I think sometimes we really don't think about what does it mean when somebody calls for an overdose, right? And what happens. And as someone who's used drugs, someone who has worked in harm reduction and really just listening to people, right? When nobody else is listening to them, just sitting there helping them as they would come to me with charges of $500, $800 tickets, their cars impounded. What does that mean when someone responds to an overdose and they call 911? They're scared, they want help, and they end up with a ticket, right? Or they go to jail. Data, I'm going to say, is really hard to obtain on overdose interactions and police response. And so I say take this with a grain of salt and probably times it by 4, right? Because sometimes the charges are not just paraphernalia offenses. Sometimes they're disorderly conduct and other kind of like oddball charges. So in 2019, Michigan had 5,067 paraphernalia offenses and 1,600 arrests, right? So 3.6% of them were in Washtenaw County. That is a huge piece of 183. So, you know, almost 1% a day is getting these charges, right? And this number has increased in many areas. But what, you can go to the next slide. What kind of really blew my mind, and I knew this from participants, I mean, I would give out supplies where I worked or meet somebody somewhere, and I will say I've been distributing supplies for about 15 years now. As soon as someone leaves the area, right, they're being arrested. So in 2019, for instance, in Washtenaw County, out of those 183 people, 68% of them were in Pittsfield Township. Pittsfield only makes up 7.9% of the county's population. So if a tiny little area is making up a huge impact on mass incarceration, what does safety look like for those people, right? What are they going to do? Because once you get one charge, you're never going to call again. Because 3 charges, it's a felony and you're going away, right? So this is not only disrupting the individual from getting any treatment services or help that they need, this is impacting communities. This is such a larger picture. And also programs such as harm reduction programs, they have to play in this gray legal area to provide public health equipment to people so they can practice safer drug use and they can, you know, receive whatever services that they need. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So another piece, you know, when I say this, I will say right away, some people, yes, their stories and they feel they benefited from jail. They benefited from treatment. That's great. Absolutely, some people do. But for the vast majority, jailing and other types of carceral systems increase overdose rates. It increases harm. And we don't do this for any other health condition. So one thing gets brought up is Good Samaritan laws. Oh, you can call. Okay. I've called, I've had CPS show up, I've had police show up and take away a friend's baby. It doesn't always protect you and it doesn't always protect the situation. There's limitations. People that are on probation or parole, they don't qualify. Police discretion is used. Very often, we've heard a previous police chief who recently resigned say, I'm not applying this Good Samaritan law. These people are criminals. They're using drugs. They're going to jail. And so giving a police discretion is really only impacting the hospitals, the morgue, right? And then other social services that now have a bigger legal barrier to face to get people help. Michigan also has a drug homicide law. So if I provide a substance to someone and they overdose, I'm going to jail, right? And I can be charged with homicide. But the supply has really been awful. The drug supply since COVID has changed tremendously to where we're having xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer. Propane we've had in Ann Arbor, right? Purple dope about 2 years ago, it was horrific. And then other supplies and a cross-contamination because people are put in situations where things are mixing, right? And they don't even know. So when we have these laws that really aren't based on evidence, aren't based on science, and they're based on moral failings and, you know, otherisms, right? And like really that discrimination against people who use drugs and people who sell drugs. people are less likely to call 911. And our overdose rates are becoming alarmingly scary and disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. And much effort is really needed to make drastic changes. So you can go to the next slide. In 2022 so far, we've lost over 1,300 people. And data is always higher once everything gets reported, right? But we're just losing our parents, children, family, and friends to preventable overdose deaths that really immediately policies could be changed and make a direct impact. Go ahead and go to the next slide. With the power dynamics in play, when we think about community safety and overdoses being preventable, these systemic, structural, and societal racism, hatred for people who use drugs, and promoting like the inadequate access to healthcare, education, housing, social services, and induced trauma. Someone in the chat said about treatment beds. Absolutely. I call all the time and I can't get people into treatment for various reasons who want to go, and I watch them all the time. And whether it's for MOUD, whether it's for detox and patient, it doesn't matter. You can't get in, right? Or once you have a record, you can't get in. There's so many stipulations. And if we invested in that community care to where people who needed treatment, who wanted treatment, were able to get in that day, that would be astronomical changes that would impact how many people we're losing and reduce those losses. And so with this power dynamic, just the fear of arrest, this trauma, we really got to think about what does community safety look like, and really reimagine how can we provide a healing environment for individuals. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I do a lot of virtual spotting, so I watch someone or if I go there just to make sure that they're safe. For decades, people who've used drugs have developed ways to keep us safe when people have failed us, who make decisions for us, who, you know, limit us from protecting ourselves. And we've managed to survive. But with the drug supply becoming so toxic and unpredictable, we can't keep up. With the economic crisis, with the housing crisis, right? Like people are trying to survive and it's becoming an overwhelming system that's collapsing on itself locally and throughout the nation. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so today's International Overdose Awareness Day, right? And when I think about this, I see, let's spread naloxone everywhere. Okay, that's great. Absolutely. Naloxone is still criminalized. Originally, naloxone was controlled like opioid. It was really hard to get. And some states still do criminalize naloxone. Law enforcement treats it as paraphernalia. And it's basically evidence of illegal drug use. And even as of last year, I've had people that I've given injectable naloxone have their needles confiscated, right? So like they can't give naloxone because now the needle's gone, right? And you have the vial. And so when I think about this, I got to think about these survival mechanisms of listening to community members. And naloxone, you know, came out in the US in the 1990s. And we're still talking about, you know, getting naloxone out there when this is over 20, 30 years ago. We've had this distribution going on by community members. And this was really a response to people starting to see more overdoses as fentanyl started trickling in, and the inconsistent supply. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So Chicago Recovery Alliance, if you don't know about them, when they started, it was two people who used drugs, and they used kind of that same thing Crows is talking about, this community-based participatory model where You're getting information from people that are most directly impacted. One of the founders, Dan Big, who we lost a few years ago, he heard of this Take Home Naloxone program back in '96 that was going on in Scotland, right? And so he was able to get a physician to prescribe this to us. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So, actually go up. I don't know why. Sorry, I think it like jumped. But
May I go back?
Yeah, go to the big love one.
Yeah. Okay, you see it okay?
Yeah. So if nobody's ever met Dan, he was a huge character in the room. He didn't really play by the rules, and that's what made him so awesome, because he knew people were at risk of dying. He was watching everyone, and he constantly fought to get naloxone into the hands of people who use drugs. So Dan would carry around a duffel bag, and everybody knew what the duffel bag was because he would start passing out naloxone, right? It was still illegal. This was like late 90s, right? And so he would fly to India, get supplies, bring them back, be able to distribute naloxone. And this was saving people. Nobody was calling 911, right? Because we knew, one, they refused to carry naloxone, but then two, you were going to be in trouble. So you got to keep each other safe. And at that time, it was an opioid reversal. People who use Narcan, they were okay. It didn't have the benzos and other things that are more concerning right now. So back in 2000, he was able to make a bulk purchase with a naloxone supplier and get that order out, and more people started distributing. One really big thing, you can go to the next slide. One really big thing was he empowered individuals, right? Most of the time, people who use drugs were not empowered while they're keeping each other safe. They were told, you're a junkie, you're an addict, you're just gonna die, and you're not gonna be able to help other people. You're powerless. And what Dan did was he really focused on that, empowering individuals and any positive change. And when he did that, people just, the amount of shame and that worthlessness started becoming a pride thing, because they were the heroes. They were saving themselves. And when people started pushing back, his statement was, dead drug users don't recover. Everybody wants people to recover, but you can't if you die, right? And so how do we make it to where we have these things in place for community safety, where people feel empowered, whether it's through mental health, housing, whatever that is, but not making police be the all-encompassing person to go to, because they have other priorities, and they really should be dealing with those priorities and not, medical concerns, right? Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I only have a few more. I just like talking. I'd rather listen to you all. So Chicago Recovery Alliance made the first naloxone distribution program, tracking the numbers, doses, and they were really able to document the data before the CDC ever stepped in. So the CDC finally published a report about take-home naloxone, and this was 2010. So we had all those years from the 90s and 2000s, and finally somebody said, oh yeah, we should write this down, right? Like, we need to make a report that this is going on and how bad this is. We knew what was going on with HIV and hepatitis C transmission, and those things started, coming more popular. But naloxone kind of got pushed back and hidden, and really it was the hatred for people who use drugs. So with this delayed responses, they finally published in the Morbid and Mortality Weekly reports that how successful naloxone distribution was. Oh, you can go to the next slide, sorry. And that the biggest thing that still today happens is that the documentation for reversals by people who use drugs right, make up the vast majority of naloxone administrations. There's reports from 80 to 90% of community members saving themselves and others. And so next slide. Okay, so this is my favorite. And I'm so sad he's not on this call, but does anybody else know who got naloxone from Dan Big, like in the community? My hero. Okay, click that just one. Okay, so Lamont. Lamont saved my life. He saved many of my friends. I can't tell you how much this man put on the line to help save people in Washtenaw County. And there was many others I absolutely adore. But Lamont is one person that sat there as I was a teenager doing all kinds of stuff that just was like, what are you doing, kid? And just talk to me as a person. And empowerment of saying, not having someone talk down to you, but saying, hey, here's some supplies. How can we make you safer? What are your needs, right? And that alone has saved so many people that go unnoticed in this community. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. And so what Lamont and so many others provided is this healing-centered response, right? That we know things are going to happen in life, and that's part of the human experience. And we want to honor that survival and healing. And we don't want to make people feel worse. And we want to provide that space for connection and learning and really unlearning, right? Like we want to unlearn all this trauma and all these things that we hold against ourselves so that we can have more of a holistic and community response. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. And so when I think about this, I think about this Maslow's hierarchy needs for drug users. So much of these things are taken away by the carceral system. So many things like, the ability to sleep, right? And safe environments. If you're in a shelter, that's really scary, right? You lost your housing, you lose your family a lot of times. And yeah, you may do harms, but you can't build that bridge without having some type of healing-centered environment where we can have family members reconnecting. And we can have that confidence of saying, yeah, I screwed up, but I still love you and let's move forward, right? And what does that response look like when we have a way to embrace it with compassion and resources for those directly impacted that aren't a part of this carceral system, that's allowing the community members to heal and have that response to where people aren't scared to get the help they need. That's all. And you can go to the next one, but that's just my resources. I have a lot. I'll add anybody and share things. I have a weird thing for collecting information, so it's absolutely open access. Does anybody have questions?
So thank you, Ashley. I hope it's a little bit more clear how we think there is an intersection between thinking about an unarmed public safety response and people who use drugs in the community. I think Ashley did a great job of sort of tying that together. And our piece was showing how we hope Ann Arbor can evolve to a model like that. Do you guys have questions, comments, thoughts?
Can you give an example of someone with living experience that would be beneficial in administering unarmed response?
You want that?
Sure. I think it's broken down because we all have various intersectionalities, right? For me, when I think about overdose response, I want people who are actively using. I want that living experience of whether they're using now, have used, you know, they could not, and whatever definition of recovery that they have. To me, that's really big, because sometimes if you don't use, some of these things are just like odd nuances, right? And I'm like, man, people are so lucky to not know these things. And, you know, just like other community members, I'm not going to go into a community that I've never been in, that I'm not a part of. I want those community members to be able to help themselves with lived experience, right? So it really is just those people that have been impacted directly and still are, those are the responders.
And I'd add that there are programs across the country that have extensive training programs for people who have lived experiences, for example, in intimate partner violence situations, in other kinds of violent situations, and they have the experience. And so there are things that they notice in those interactions that people who have only textbook training don't have, although I am absolutely acknowledging that many people who go to school and get degrees and get licensed also have lived experiences in those areas. But there are many kinds of programs across the country that take people without some of those licensures or degrees or academic credentials and do extensive training for them, but they are building on what those people have already experienced. And violence interrupters are a huge example of that. And there's a lot of data that I'm trying to think, it wasn't NIDA, but one of the National Institutes of Health agencies published a pretty extensive report on how they have been used across the country in different situations. And what happens is if you paid people a living wage, and lots of times you're using people who were formerly incarcerated, who are, as Ashley said, comfortable in situations where many others are not comfortable, and they're able to recognize things, and then they get trained on how to do conflict resolution, sometimes preventative things. A little bit of that is happening in Ann Arbor right now, and other kinds of interactions to mediate. The experiences that they have are just invaluable in being able to go into those situations and deal with them in a situationally competent way.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, if nobody else have a question, I do. I'll just keep asking if nobody. Can you tell me how close are you to go live with crows in our area? I heard you say you're going to start in Ann Arbor and then spread to Ypsilanti. How close are we to getting crows in our community?
A few things have to happen, and a few of those are dependent on the city of Ann Arbor's timeline. So they have not yet released a request for proposals for agencies to propose to staff an unarmed response or to develop an unarmed response program. We expect that'll probably happen. They're still doing outreach, so I would not expect that to happen before October or November. I don't know when the RFP would close and how fast they would make a decision about that, but I know that would likely happen in the first quarter or the second quarter of 2023. We are writing grants, and we've been so lucky to be successful at getting some grants. And so we're already in the process of doing outreach in Ann Arbor and beginning to do so in Ypsilanti, writing another grant right now for Washtenaw County to be able to do that more extensively across Washtenaw County, to get input and feedback from people who would be directly impacted by these programs to determine what they should look like, because they could look slightly different in Ypsilanti than they would in Ann Arbor, for example, right? And as well they should. And if we're in Pittsfield Township or Saline or Dexter or Manchester or they should reflect those communities a bit. And so we are working on that now. I don't think we'd be able to go live before next summer, and there is always a possibility that crows might not apply for the RFP from the city if it contains some kinds of things that are not values aligned. If it had requirements in there for monitoring or surveillance, for example, that we find to be detrimental and harmful and not aligned with our values. And so we are already beginning to explore funding from foundations and others to be able to run such a program without government assistance if that's necessary. And there are agencies like that across the country. One in Minneapolis is called REP. Oh, and I cannot think of what their acronym stands for, but it's REP as in Paul. And they have decided that they are not taking any municipal money for the first 10 years of their existence. I think they're in year 5, because they want to make sure they can develop a program that's up and running and sustainable and that aligns with their values without having any kind of outside influence. And so they are scaling up gradually, and they've been able to do that without any government money. So there are a few options for us. And certainly if we are not waiting on, city money from Ann Arbor, then we may scale up a little bit more quickly than we would otherwise. So I think Ashley put the link to our website in there, and you can certainly follow us to get updates, etc. Thank you so much, Ashley, for posting the link for REP, and you can kind of see what they do. And that's an example of a grassroots group that started like ours. They're very small, but now they have paid staff and have trained staff. And one of the strengths of their organization is empowering the community to solve problems themselves. And that is not sort of abandoning people with, here's a handout on how to do it. They are actively training the community, and they document data pre and post, and are constantly working in those communities to document how people are solving those problems and how conflict resolution, for example, is improving across the community. I think about, so I grew up in Detroit, and I think about the guy this weekend who was just randomly killing people in Detroit. I don't know if you guys heard about this. I think he started out around 7 Mile in Livernois, which is where I grew up. And he just was out in the middle of the night shooting people. And there was one person that survived, one person who survived. And that person survived because his neighbors intervened. Mm-hmm. They heard shots fired, and some of them, I'm not advocating that we do this, but some of them had handguns license registered of their own, and they went out. One person shot in the air, and the person ran off. Another person administered medical aid to the person. A person heard one person did not have a weapon and yelled at the shooter. And the person fled, and the person shot the man who was walking his dog, shot him and the dog. Both survived, but those neighbors intervened. And I'm not saying that people should run out in the street when there are guns blazing and do things that they were afraid of. But the person who did intervene had been in a situation like that before, was not particularly afraid, and went out and chased the gunman away. And so just to double down, I'm not saying we need to do that. We're not training community members to do that, but I am pointing out that there are people who have had different experiences, who have different levels of fear, experience, understanding of situations, and that is the only person who survived, the person whose neighbors intervened at 4:30 in the morning. And so it was just like the latest, most salient example in my mind of how what happens when communities decide to be responsible for each other and to each other.
I like that. I remember a time when people in the community would get involved.
And I think there are a number of reasons why we don't now. We don't know our neighbors, all these kinds of things, right? But can those communities be developed? Yes. And do they exist now? Yes. I could go on for hours about examples of that. In San Diego, there's a group of Somalian grandmas or aunties who worked out an intimate partner violence intervention. And the police were really upset because they would be called, and then, often spouses did not want the other spouse to be arrested because they're just going to be in jail. They can't work. They can't help support the family. That's not what we want. We just want them to stop. And so arresting them is not part of the problem. They're explicit about that. Now in Michigan, if a person gets called, an arrest will be made of at least one, or if not both of the parties, because that's the law in Michigan. In California, that was not the case. And so the community set up this group of aunties. And when you have an intimate partner violence incident, whether it leads to violence or not, you go to the aunties and they mediate. And this works for them. And the police were like, oh my gosh, we're not getting these calls anymore. What is going on? How is this happening? But the community figured that out. And when we help people have the tools to facilitate that, in this case, they did that on their own, but can we facilitate that? Absolutely. And that's a part of public safety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Eileen, I see your screen is lit up, but we can't hear you.
Sorry, that was an accident.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a comment. I live in Pittsfield Township, and I was blown away by Ashley's presentation. I lived right here in Pittsfield Township and didn't know that.
Me too, Audrey. I live in Pittsfield
I
now.
pulled theirs because theirs is the highest, but it happens everywhere. It happens all the time. It's just one of those things where our state law allows harm reduction to function, but it's not clear enough. And so local ordinances have these, paraphernalia laws, and it could be for different things, but like that's a huge one that impacts public health. People getting, what services they need. It's unfortunate and it's a fight, but I'm still going to call Pittsfield out when the percentages are outrageous.
Wow, that blew me away.
It's interesting. We, Pittsfield just had that big millage, the public safety millage, and it was fascinating to me. Sort of, the first one they had failed, and then they did another one, and it was really interesting to look at, sort of how they spun the need for more police this time around.
Right.
And they did a better job of spinning it, and they talked about a lot of stuff. And I went to a couple of public forums and I asked some hard questions about, because they mentioned some drug interaction stuff, and I asked them to operationalize what they were talking about, and they couldn't do that. And it was, it was just a bunch of bullet points and sort of talking points. But in my mind, it just means kind of more surveillance, more arrests, and more of what Ashley has shown us.
So in doing crows, and say for instance, someone who has ingested, a substance and they're out of control, what would crows do for that person? I mean, we don't have facilities. What commonly happens is, okay, police is called, that person is taken to jail. How would crows intervene in that situation to get that person to a safe place, stabilize that person? Where would they take that person to be stabilized?
Ashley, you want to jump in first, or?
Yeah, so I think, what we do now, there's lots of groups that do it when somebody's having some type of chaotic substance use, or maybe they're over amping, which happens more with stimulants. And those who have like maybe some other mental health conditions, it would just be like a crisis response first. Like, are they safe? Like, are they physically safe? Mentally, how can I provide an environment, right? So a lot of assessments first of, are they on the street and they're stuck there? Have they had something to eat? I'd say a lot of times food, heat, like all these environmental things come into place. And if they have a safe place to go, then it's what kind of supports do they need? What kind of environments do they have? And then if they don't, is there ways through mutual aid or other places that we have a location where they can sit and stay? be connected to housing, be connected to, you know, whatever services. So a lot of it is assessment, just like you would for a mental health crisis assessment. Like, what does that person need? What does that person want? And when I say what do they need, I mean determined by them, because it could be very different. And I think that's something we have to change in our mindset of that they're not the experts, right? Like we have to switch that and say they know what they need, but in this moment, how can we provide that support until they're able to help tell us what that is?
And I've talked to some harm reduction specialists. I'm trying to think. This group was in Oakland, California, and we were talking about this, and we were talking about because they have a policy of not doing any sort of forced commitments. And we were asking, what do you do? And one woman said straight up, she just sits with the person. And if she has to sit with the person on the curb for 4 hours, that is what she does. And obviously you can see how that's not going to be tenable for maybe, you know, a community mental health or whatever, right? Because they don't have time to do that. But this is what she does. She just sits there.
Now that's grassroots.
It's so common to just sit with people, literally get them some food, sit with them and reduce stimulus around them. It's amazing. It works. They may need housing and other things, but just sitting and being calm and not threatening with forced coercion or treatment, police, whatever that is, and just being there to support them, all the difference in the world.
I'm glad you said that. Because I have seen that, and I have reached out to a person that clearly was just drugged out. I don't know any other way to put it, but I was so concerned and so worried for this person. And I reached out to him. And when I did, I could see how startled he was and actually had a fearful like response. But I didn't know what to do from there. So we as a community need education in regards to these issues as well. So I just sat in my car, and what I did was prayed for him because I was really concerned for his safety.
I'm thinking about a call I got from someone who called me because they didn't want to call the police. And there was a kid walking down Plymouth Road who seemed as if he had been using some substance, did not have on shoes or a shirt. He was probably about 13 years old, African-American, and the person who called was terrified that somebody was going to call the police and the kid was going to get injured. And we did not have anybody to call. And
Right.
so the person called me and they were like, do you know anybody who we can call? Do you know like a police officer who's really cool, who will help? Do you know a social worker? Whom do you know? I used to be on the board of Ozone House. We have peer outreach workers. We have workers who work with young people all the time in these situations. And I called a couple people I knew and nobody was picking up. And so I just went, and me and this person just, hung out with this kid for a while. I mean, I don't even remember where we ended up, how we ended up walking. We ended up walking to like all the way down Plymouth Road, almost to, it doesn't matter, but we walked down Plymouth Road for a while, and we ended up just sitting down and talking to this kid for like 2 hours while they kind of came down and asked them, if they would like to go to Ozone House, or if they would like to, if there's anywhere we could take them. And ultimately they said they wanted to go home, and we drove them home. And I did not know what to do. I mean, I didn't know what to do other than be there, but there were not a huge number of services available to this kid because of their age. And I think the person who called me was concerned that they would be perceived to be older and would be, because there's often misjudging age of people of color, and perceived to be an adult and treated like an adult or harmed in some
Right.
way. And when I got there, I was like, wow, this kid is younger than my kid and my son. And so the person who called just kind of followed the kid. And then I just went and we just hung out. The three of us just hung out for a while. And we were like, are you hungry? Do you want to eat? We grabbed some Wendy's, you know, and you know, we just sat there, and it's not, you know, as dramatic as, you know, but you know, I grew up, I'm older, so, and I grew up in Detroit, and my dad ran community mental health in Detroit, but he ran in the 70s when there was much more what you would do. And so, you know, social work then was a little bit different. And you know, his job was just to go out, and the people who worked there was just to go out and you know, do a lot more, you know, sort of community stuff. Maybe I know that is actually coming back. There's a resurgence of community social work now. But that is what I saw as a kid. And so I'm a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, and I'm not a clinician, I'm a researcher, but you know, I didn't know what else to do either, but just sit with this kid. And so we fed the kid and sat there and hung out. And I think, you know, we can get lots of people to do that, and we can have some agreements within communities that that's important to do. And so there's an expectation of that. And there's a group in Ypsilanti where there was a reading program, but there was violence and drug trade going on the street where people needed to cross that street to get to the program. And a deal was cut with those sellers and some of the members perpetrating violence to let moms and kids cross safely to that program. I mean, that is happening today. That was Ypsilanti, and people can make agreements within their community. Okay, look, can we just have a little safe zone for kids and moms to go to this reading program? And they were like, yeah, sure, okay.
That
and
may
we can
be,
do that.
Yeah, that may be the Black Men Read program.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of that going on where you see a person have overused a substance, and it's who do you call? So how do we support CROs? How do we get involved? How do we push this? It's very much needed. Because I have seen it. I have seen a person in their car just nodding out in traffic in their car.
Yeah.
Because they were so high.
Right. You don't want that person to, you know, drive off and injure themselves or somebody else because of that. I'm going to put the link to our website there, because there's like a take action thing. There's a place where you can sign up just to keep up. If you are a Facebook user, I can get our Facebook link up in a second, but we try to update on what's going on. And what we're doing right now is just starting to do outreach in the community and ask people what they want to see. Let me see. There's Facebook.
I'm on my phone, so it's not easy to get to the links, but on Facebook, I can do that. Do I look for CROS on Facebook?
Or maybe spell it out, Coalition for Re-envisioning Our Safety.
Okay. Okay.
And you will find us. And so, you know, and we're always interested in talking to anybody in the community. The fact that you live in Pittsfield is not, you know, does not mean that we would not be interested in talking to you as well. So we are starting in Ann Arbor, but there is no doubt that, you know, our goal is to reach across Washtenaw County.
Great, great.
And Ashley just posted a link in the chat as well about policy advocacy regarding overdose prevention in the state of Michigan.
Looking at policy is critical.
Yep.
Because policies need to change. Is WHI going to follow up with providing this information via email as a follow-up? Do you know?
I don't know, but we can make our slides available and our notes and links and stuff so that they can do that.
That would be helpful.
I'm just gonna post the direct link for those who are interested to the overdose prevention. And this is just a mailing list to get updates and advocacy resources. So,
Thank you.
of course.
And the one about policies, because really looking at policies to change policies is critical.
Yeah, so that's the last link. And it's just, if you just Google Michigan overdose prevention, you'll find their site and you can sign up and be in the loop about advocacy and policy and how to support that.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right, I think we are at time, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us, for considering these ideas. I think one of the big things for us is understanding that we have to have a shift in the way that we think about things and the way we conceptualize autonomy and who uses drugs and how we interact with police and how we see public safety. And once we can begin to shift the way we think about it, we can certainly change policy and we can change behavior and we can create some things that may be more functional for us. So thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you both for the work you do.
All right, take care.
Thank you.